emphasize the enormous public demand for federal action to curb capitalism's worst excesses, both in TR's day and FDR's. The first Roosevelt, I'm sure most of you know this very well, the first Roosevelt ascended to the nation's highest office upon President William McKinley's assassination in 1901. The country had recently emerged from the Depression of 1893 to 1898, which was the most severe in American history until that time. Franklin D. Roosevelt took his inaugural oath on March 4th, 1933, an even darker day. Economic catastrophe had idled 25% of the workforce, closed all of the banks in 23 of the nation's 48 states, and made the future of both democracy and capitalism seem problematic. My longer paper will also stress that each Roosevelt presided over federal government expansion that was unprecedented, but quite modest by European standards. Both Roosevelts effectively opposed socialism through stealing a small portion of its appeal. Significantly, these defenders of capitalism avoided resorting to the massive federal persecution that eviscerated the SP after 1917 and decimated the CPUSA between 1949 and 1957. They did not even attempt to delegitimize common socialist terms, such as capitalist, working class, class struggle, bourgeoisie, and plutocracy. These words would virtually vanish from the American lexicon during the Cold War. Many 21st century people welcomed their return. Theodore Roosevelt's conservative biographer, Jean M. Yarbrough, notes that academic historians have dwelt upon TR, the man of action. For different reasons, she writes, they, quote, also have not regarded Roosevelt's thought as worthy of serious consideration, end quote. Now, one does not need to share Yarbrough's politics to agree that assessing TR's legacy, again quoting Yarbrough, is no easy task because he tended to say different things at different times to different audiences. He disingenuously mischaracterized the SP as championing, quote, violent socialist upheavals. TR was clearly a nationalist and a jingoist, characteristics few socialists would support. Yet by his final 2 years in office, he had moved significantly to the left. Thereafter, he became even more progressive. Virtually all historians have had to decide whether to assess TR's legacy by its words or by the president's deeds. Theodore Roosevelt's more moderate biographer, H.W. Brands, argues that Roosevelt established the principle that, quote, the people of the United States acting through their government have a right to regulate the private economy in the public interest. Antitrust suits, consumer protection laws, maximum rates for railroads, and federal stewardship of natural resources proved dramatic innovations in their day. Yet, they did not make the private economy a people's economy. Unlike Europe's democratic socialists in mid-century and British Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn today, TR never considered nationalizing the economy's commanding heights. Theodore Roosevelt, in his most progressive campaign for the presidency in 1912, abandoned trust-busting and advocated regulating monopolies in the public interest. He sought to prohibit using corporate funds for political purposes. He demanded that company directors be held criminally responsible for their firm's lawbreaking. He urged enactment of workmen's compensation acts, factory laws to protect women and children, and job training for students not bound for college. Finally, TR supported both a progressive income tax and a graduated inheritance levy on the wealthy. Yet Roosevelt continued to mislabel as violent America's Socialist Party. Moderate SP head Eugene V. Debs, who helped pioneer industrial unionism in America, risked his personal popularity and his movement's growth in 1912 to expel the industrial workers of the world, IWW, often described as the SP's labor union affiliate. Debs insisted that the IWW's advocacy of industrial sabotage constituted, quote, the tactics of anarchist individuals and not socialist collectivists, end quote. Debs considered direct action by workers at the point of production, quote, reactionary, not revolutionary, and argued that tolerating it would play directly into the hands of the capitalist enemy by opening the movement to agents provocateur and thereby leave SP members, quote, responsible for the deed of every spy or madman. Excuse me. Debs' Socialist Party, which had grown large and influential during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, fell victim to massive U.S. government persecution under TR's Democratic Party successor, Woodrow Wilson. When Debs campaigned for the office again in 1920, he did so from Atlanta Penitentiary. He had been imprisoned for saying publicly, in an atmosphere of World War hysteria, words he had uttered many times before, according to his biographer, Nick Salvatore, criticizing, quote, corporate government and corporate leaders, end quote. Whereas TR was content merely to slander the SP, he did nothing to physically abuse it or its functionaries. Prison destroyed Debs' already fragile health. He had entered Atlanta a very old 63, and it ultimately contributed to his death. In one of history's ironies, conservative Republican Chief Executive Warren G. Harding commuted Debs' sentence, hosted Debs at the White House, and enthusiastically shook his hand in 1921. If Theodore Roosevelt established that American government has a right to regulate the private economy in the public interest, Franklin D. Roosevelt demonstrated that government can legitimately do so in a big way. More than any other individual, FDR created the capitalist welfare state in what historian William E. Leuchtenberg decades ago called a halfway revolution. The latter Roosevelt fought the Great Depression with unprecedented vigor, giving the country a New Deal. Through tsunamis of congressional activity, primarily in 1933 and 1935, his administration expanded federal authority and responsibility. The national government hired millions of unemployed Americans to build bridges, tunnels, hospitals, courthouses, post offices, and airport landing strips. FDR's presidency dealt a mortal blow to child labor in America. Hiring by the federal government was not limited to blue-collar workers, as the Federal Writers Project and the Federal Theater Project demonstrated. Boldest of the New Deal's permanent reforms were federal old age insurance and unemployment compensation. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal stole the thunder of the Socialist Party, which withered and nearly died in the 1930s, while its new leader, Norman Thomas, won nearly universal respect as an individual moral man. Internal divisions tore his movement apart. At the same time, FDR won over millions who had followed Depression-era demagogues. Three of many, and they appeared in virtually every part of the country. Three of many, Dr. Francis Townsend, Father Charles Coughlin, and Senator Huey Long, promised more than anyone could possibly deliver. In such an atmosphere, the CPUSA surpassed the socialists and rose to its modest pinnacle in American life. Although the CP never surpassed 90,000 members, it delivered an impact far disproportionate to its numbers. America's communists were strongest among the among the Congress of Industrial Organization, CIO, union organizers, and various shapers of public opinion. The latter included writers, the Hollywood community, intellectuals, African-American militants, and politicized youth. Significantly, however, the Communist Party grew by supporting FDR tactically in 1936 and openly in 1944. The two greatest dreams of Earl Brown, its most successful leader, were to be known as a world-class Marxist theoretician and to have the CP recognized as the New Deal's left wing. Yet the first time the communists differed with Roosevelt in a major way, by supporting the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, FDR's Justice Department sent Browder to prison on a dubious passport technicality. As my longer paper will detail, FDR always made the smallest concessions necessary to placate the left while preserving capitalism's hegemony. To conclude this brief account, we may be saying mercifully, to conclude this brief account, TR and FDR did much to humanize a brutal, racist economic system. That system in the United States has proven itself inefficient, needing federal bailout heart transplants in 1933 and 2008. Capitalism wastes immeasurable human capital every year through poor education, unemployment and underemployment, and failure to provide universal health care. The Roosevelts, especially Franklin, helped postpone its passing by marginalizing the domestic left without utilizing repression or terror to do so. In the future, however, any left that would greatly modify capitalism would do well to avoid Karl Marx's doctrine that socialism's victory is inevitable. The new movement will have to be much more competent, vastly more formidable, and significantly less complacent than were the SP and the CPUSA. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, so Gordon Henderson, get up there and
I got one for you, Jim.
Yes, sir.
So, I'm thinking in terms of Martin Luther King meeting Stokely Carmichael, or Gandhi meeting militant Hindus. Does it help FDR to have the Communist Party in order for him to pass the legislation, having a more extreme vision?
Well, to answer you, I'll quote from a paper that I'm writing for another place, in that when Earl Brown in 1938 and shortly thereafter, right up until the Nazi-Soviet Pact, declared that the Communist Party was the New Deal's left wing, FDR remained silent, allowing the communist leader to name drop. And so I'm not sure that the communists necessarily helped Roosevelt, but they didn't bother Roosevelt, and he was willing to let them grab some of the New Deal's legitimacy until the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Then the response was very similar to that which a conservative Republican might have dealt. Browder went to jail for renewing a passport which had expired, and in his renewal process, he falsely stated that he had never had a passport before. A similar act shortly before Browder's arrest brought a $500 fine to a musician. Browder was sentenced to 4 years in Atlanta Penitentiary. Now, during the war, as a gesture of unity toward the Soviet Union, Roosevelt commuted Browner's sentence to time served. But you have on one hand a non-political, presumably non-political musician getting a $500 fine, and Browner getting 4 years in what was a very tough prison. Atlanta was very primitive. Its water supply often broke down. Can you imagine a prison without water? In any case, I'm probably filibustering here. So, other questions for our colleague or me?
Real quick one.
Sure.
Why did anybody care about whether they have passports previously?
Well, there's a federal law. There's several federal laws regarding passport.
Binding your application.
Well, yeah. When you lie to the federal government, something bad's going to happen.
Yeah.
Browner got away with this until the Communist Party differed with the Roosevelt administration. Then suddenly he was not only sent to prison, but hit with a harder penalty than most people get. That's a political use of power. Yes, sir.
I really enjoyed both presentations, really interesting. By the way, I have an interesting heritage. My grandfather came to this country in 1892, and not long after, and he rolled cigars at the Samuel Gompers Union in Chicago with his brother and with a guy by the name of Bill Paley, who was the first who started CBS, by the way. So it's an interesting group of Russian Jewish immigrants who did this. And he got arrested as an anarchist. Now, what did that mean? They wanted an 8-hour workday.
Yeah.
So they got arrested. So it's an interesting background. So I come by my attitudes through heredity. I was in a businessmen's group. I'm still in it, and I still remember that the guys in it were almost all they were fairly wealthy businessmen. They did very well, and they were, of course, pretty conservative. And I didn't mind it until they took on Roosevelt and started saying that this country, with Roosevelt, he started all this crap that's going on. That was the comment. And I said, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. If it wasn't for Roosevelt coming in with workman's compensation and health laws and so on and so forth,
We're bailing up the bank.
and we would have gone, the country would have gone communist. It could have gone communist.
It could have been something different than it is, something farther to the left of where we are now. It could have been, for instance, instead of buying the preferred stock of the banks to pump money into the banks in 1933, why not nationalize the banks?
Yeah.
That's what true socialists would do. Nationalize the banks because obviously preferred stock doesn't confer ownership.
Yeah, but I think that the whole idea of Roosevelt being a bad guy for modifying, and his uncle as well, for modifying capitalism by antitrust laws and so on, and taking the rough edges off of capitalism, saved this country.
Most American historians, I'm not sure about political scientists because I'm not one, but most American historians would agree with you totally.
Oh, good.
That the Roosevelts saved capitalism.
I think so.
Luxemburg's term, used 50 years ago, still is popular. A halfway revolution between unregulated capitalism of 1929 and the democratic socialism that the British Labour Party would bring about with the defeat of Winston Churchill shortly after World War II.
Yeah.
Somewhere in between. Now the Democrats and Republicans disagree as to where,
Yeah.
but somewhere in between sits the New Deal. Is your hand up, or is that just a camera?
The political scientist always remembers that characterization of the New Deal, the Great Depression, that the states were just absolutely flat out broke. And it really started in 1928. I mean, the decline,
26
Happened like
with the
that.
housing market.
so that the national government had to actually, political scientists, when we talk about, well, this is when the federal government gets into doling out money and that way controlling states, but then there's this whole business of preserving capitalism.
Mhm.
And capitalism was the engine of that prosperity, and you had to do that. I mean, it's politics. I'm not saying it's moral, I'm saying it's politics.
Robert Carroll's first book on Johnson, he has the most wonderful description of what it was like on the farms in the United States when you had auctioneers shot. And I think, you know, we don't remember that. Thank God for some of these authors that help us remember what we got through.
Well, it's not taught in K through 12. How could we remember it? You have to go to college. You have to look into radicalism to learn these things. The bonus march, where today's soldiers fired on yesterday's soldiers. That is not the mark of a stable republic. That's a mark of a society in deep, deep trouble.
General MacArthur defended the Washington against that.
He burned down Anacostia Flats,
Yeah.
where a Hooverville, the largest Hooverville in the country, housed World War I soldiers who were simply there to pick up a bonus which Congress had already promised them, but they wanted to pick it up 13 years early. And for that, President Hoover told MacArthur to drive the men out of Washington, across the bridge, back into Anacostia. On his own, MacArthur set the shantytown of Anacostia on fire. And this was not the last time, obviously, that General MacArthur would disobey a president. Yes, sir.
I think you're right, the author was right, in terms of a halfway revolution, because to give context to what we